I'm proud to welcome you to a special series of the Exceptional Advisor podcast. Hi, I'm Bob Powell. Over the next several weeks, this special series will highlight exceptional advisors in these extraordinary times. We hope this series helps you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences in light of the unique challenges and emerging norms of the current times. Today, my guest is Don Trone, L5, the CEO and co-founder of 3Ethos. So, welcome to the podcast, Don.
Yeah, great to be here, Bob.
It's our pleasure. So let's start, for the benefit of our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, if you could give us a brief bio.
Oh my God, if they're not familiar with my bio by now, Bob.
Well, I am, but some people may not be familiar with your bio. Very few.
I'll make it real quick then.
Okay.
First career as a Coast Guard helicopter pilot. And after 10 years active duty, I was working on my master's degree. And I did my thesis on how to integrate a fiduciary standard into an investment advisory practice. And I wrote that 35 years ago. And I fell in love with the subject. And so after active duty, I went into the financial services industry, worked my way through a broker-dealer and then SEI and Callan Associates. In 1999, I started FI 360. And focus of that was to develop the first uniform fiduciary practices for the industry and to build technology to support those practices. 2007, I lost control of FI 360. I won't get into that. A pretty horrendous event, though.
Right.
But serendipity, shortly thereafter, like within 2 days, and nobody knew about the takeover, but within 2 days, I got a call from the Coast Guard Academy, my alumni, asking whether I'd be willing to come back to be the first person to head up a new leadership think tank at the Academy. And I accepted. I said, I can only give you about 18 to 24 months. I'll take a sabbatical from what I'm doing. And I did that and quickly discovered in doing the research at the think tank that I could not find a framework that would integrate leadership with decision-making. And I went back to the Coast Guard and I said, this is a pretty significant finding, particularly from the world I came from, fiduciary responsibility. I said, when I think about the top fiduciaries in the financial services industry, they exhibit certain leadership behaviors, and those behaviors that they exhibit tend to impact the quality of their investment decision-making process. And Coast Guard at that point said, "We have no idea what you're talking about." But you seem to know what you're doing. Would you like to start a company to do that research? And I did, and that was the creation of 3Ethos. Today, I'm one of 5 co-founders and the CEO. And our focus of 3Ethos is what I would call an evolutionary step for fiduciary. So we're way beyond fiduciary. We now talk about behavioral governance as a new body of research that looks at the intersection or the interrelationships between leadership, stewardship, and governance.
So you've been, among other things, recently writing for 401k Specialist magazine. There's been a number of articles that you've penned that I think would be worth drilling down on. That okay?
Absolutely.
So the first one was this notion of resilience is the new critical success factor. And I'll preface my question, I guess, is by sort of noting that those of us who follow Taleb, right, and his writings, and his notion of resilience being one of the critical factors in, I guess, all things in money management and in life, right? This notion of resilience is a really important one. So, how is it that you look at resilience, and why is it the new critical success factor from your point of view?
Well, we should probably note that we're recording this May 11th, 2020. So we're around day 55, day 60 of the lockdown, COVID-19 night lockdown. And so we'll begin the process of reopening soon. And I'm a firm believer that our industry is not going to snap back to what it was prior to the COVID-19. We're all going to have a new normal. And we need to prepare for that new normal. In fact, the quality of our preparation of that new normal is going to determine how well we reopen and whether we're going to be successful in this new environment. So, in contemplating the new normal and thinking about the skills that the elite advisor is going to need to master in order to be successful, one of the terms that resonated with me was resilience. If you're a YouTube fan or a TED Talk fan, I would suggest you pull up the TED Talk by Dr. Angela Duckworth, where she talks about grit.
Well.
Yeah. And I think you're going to see a lot of people talking about resilience, perseverance, tenacity, getting back up. It's going to be a topic that a lot of people are going to be talking about. What I did with the particular article that you're referring to is I began to define resilience the way an elite financial advisor should think of the subject. And I define it as the interrelationship between five things. It's the advisor's capacity for perseverance, the advisor's sense of purpose, their principles and core values that support that sense of purpose, their passion for the purpose, and the process they follow to support that sense of purpose. So they're all interrelated, but they come together to define this concept of resilience.
And in terms of, I guess, your advice to advisors in the midst of thinking about what the new normal might look like is obviously they need to look into themselves, their practices, their teammates, et cetera, and either find resilience or discover how to acquire it.
Or develop it. I would use the word develop as opposed to acquire. The thing about resilience, we're not born with our capacity for resilience. It has to be developed. It's like our character. You're not born with a particular character. It's the environment, the world around you that shapes your character. Likewise, it's the world around you, your facts and circumstances that's going to determine your capacity for resilience. In fact, when we're talking about resilience, and I'm going to tie it back to my Coast Guard background, what all the elite military units, all the military academies, West Point, Annapolis, Coast Guard, Air Force, Kings Point, the elite units, SEALs, Delta Force, Green Beret, Recon for the Marine Corps, what they all share in common is that the candidates for these elite military activities, the candidates are all well qualified. The men and women who raise their hand and volunteer for these activities know how to succeed. They were captains of their sport teams. A lot of them were valedictorians. They're very smart people. And what all these military units share in common in terms of the training is that they know they're bringing in very capable candidates. What they don't know, and this is the focus of the training, is how resilient that candidate is. And the way they test for resilience is to make sure that every single solitary day that candidate is in training, that candidate will be presented with activities where the activities are designed to make sure the candidate fails. They're going to give you more work than you can possibly accomplish in a lot of time. They're going to ask you to run an obstacle course under a certain amount of time, which is almost impossible to do. They're just going to give you tasks knowing you're going to fail at those tasks every day. And what they want to see is whether you have the perseverance to wake up the next morning and undergo that same abuse and do so over a protracted period of time, typically at least a year. And when you look at the candidates who succeed, who make it through that training period, there's no correlation with the candidate's physical ability or mental ability. What they've determined after all this training, it's really a function of the candidate's resilience. And that's what we're going to see with the new normal with the top advisors. The top advisors won't be the most charismatic. They won't be the flashier dressers. They won't be the smartest people in the room. Now that we've gone virtual, the smartest people on the Zoomcast. It's going to be the advisors that are the most resilient.
Yeah. As you're describing resilience, I'm reminded of Admiral McRaven's commencement address that he gave at the University of Texas in Austin in 2014.
Why did you take that famous line? Why don't you give the famous line?
Make your bed.
Make your bed.
Make your bed.
Yeah.
The first step in resilience.
Actually, what the Admiral was referring to was, if you can't take responsibility for the small items, then you have no business being given responsibility for the more important.
Yeah.
And that's part of resilience as well. It's all that little nitpicky stuff, the hospital corners in the bed, spit shine shoes, polish your brass. That all has to do with resilience.
Yeah. And then the one line from that speech that sort of also rings in my head all the time, no pun intended, is about the brass bell that hangs in the center of the compound for all the students to see. And you have to, all you have to do to quit is ring the bell.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to wake up at 5 o'clock anymore.
That's right.
The tap out bell, I guess.
Yeah.
So, so do you want to move on to, you've also written a piece in 401k Specialist magazine about how to quarantine your practice during the quote unquote fiduciary flu. What's describe what that's about?
So, yes, for the listeners, you heard it right, fiduciary flu. And you heard it for the first time right here on the podcast with Bob and I. All right. This is a big subject. I am not a fan of the fiduciary standards that are coming down the road. So again, this is May, so we're almost 45, 50 days away from Reg BI. CFP board is going to be coming out with their fiduciary standard. The reason why I'm opposed, or reasons why I'm opposed, one is the new regulations, everyone's going to be a fiduciary. And yet they won't.
Right.
The new regulations are not based on a prudent process. They're not based on best practices. So if anyone is familiar with my work over the last 35 years, written 10 books on the subject of fiduciary responsibility, everything we were developing over the 35-year period was designed to meet a procedural prudence standard.
Mhm.
And if this is the first time you're hearing the word procedural prudence, what you need to know is it is a higher standard of care than the best interest standard being proposed by the regulators in the CFP board.
Mhm.
So one of the ironies about all this is, we're making everybody a fiduciary, but we're actually making them a fiduciary of a lesser standard than anything that we've been working on for the last 35 years.
Mhm.
So for a lot of the top advisors, many of whom are listening to this podcast, many of them are members of INW&I. Fiduciary has been a way that you have differentiated your practice from everyone else in the past, where you're going to lose that point of differentiation. And so that's when I began to, well, I should add one other thing. Again, this podcast is being recorded during COVID-19. And when we look at projected openings and near normal, it's going to occur. The new normal, the reopenings are going to occur about the same time these fiduciary standards are coming out. So that's when I started to think about the fact, well, just about the time we begin to come out of COVID-19, we're going to be going into these new fiduciary standards. Hence, I coined the term fiduciary flu. So how do we quarantine ourselves against the fiduciary flu? Well, first of all, you've got to find a way to differentiate yourself. And that's where we suggest the new work that we're doing in behavioral governance. Position yourself as a leader and a steward first. Fiduciary just happens to be the description of your governance process, the decision-making process. And that pretty much goes hand in hand with what we've seen with this pandemic, with COVID-19. In that, I wrote another article during the same season that said, during this crisis, no one is looking for a fiduciary. And the follow-on to that, tagline on that, is what they're looking for is a leader. In a crisis, the client's not sitting there looking, saying, gee, do I need a fee-based advisor? Do I need a fiduciary? Do I need a fiduciary who's taken an oath? Do I need, blah, blah, blah? What they want is a leader.
Right.
What they want is a trusted advisor. And I can't do justice to the description of trusted advisor that Herman Brody can. Herman's another one of the speakers for INW&I. And I would encourage everybody to listen to his presentation, get his book on the trust mandate.
Yeah, he's a fantastic speaker.
Now, where I differ from Herman is how we describe the trusted advisor. What we say is the trusted advisor needs to be compassionate, of good character or characterful, and competent. Three things: compassion, character, and competence. Where what Herman would describe, he would say the trusted advisor is benevolent and competent. So he's using the word benevolent where we're using the words compassion and characterful. In either case, I believe coming out of this COVID-19, clients are going to be looking to find the trusted advisor, the one trusted advisor in their life. So pre-COVID-19, they might have had a broker, they might have had a trust officer, they might have had a financial advisor, they might have had a financial planner, a retirement consultant. I think coming out of the crisis and the new normal, what you're going to see is clients going, I want that one person in my life that I can trust explicitly. I want that trusted advisor.
In that article that you just mentioned about how no one's looking for a fiduciary, you outlined 10 things that you should be doing No, it's great advice. I'm not sure if you want to cover some of the 10 things here or not, but I think they're useful for any advisor who does want to become a leader and a trusted advisor.
Yeah. Yeah. So the 10 things. By the way, you failed to mention the best part. There's artwork that goes with the article.
There's some great artwork. There's some great artwork.
Yeah.
Broken eggshells and whatnot. Yeah. And here and there.
Yeah. So the brief description of the artwork. The artwork has an egg carton with 3 eggs in it, and the eggs are labeled leadership, stewardship, and governance. The three elements of behavioral governance. Then alongside it is a broken egg, and the eggshell has the words fiduciary on it, so you can see it. And so the description is: this is your brain when there's a continuum between leadership, stewardship, and governance.
Yeah.
And this is your brain on proposed fiduciary standards. By the way, I'm going to digress and give you a little bit of personal history here that I don't think anybody knows.
Okay.
Do you remember who came up with the campaign, Just Say No?
Just Say No. I don't know. Maybe, was it Mrs. Reagan?
Yes, very good. Yeah. Nancy Reagan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just Say No. And to reinforce that message, that anti-drug message, they named Vice President Bush, Senior Bush, to be the first drug czar. And when they named him then as the first drug czar, they also decided that they would use a Coast Guard helicopter to transport the vice president when the vice president was serving as the drug czar. So normally, the president and vice president, their helicopter is Marine Corps One. Of course, the jet is Air Force One. Mm-hmm. So with the Coast Guard nomenclature, what do we call this Coast Guard helicopter? And so it was called Coast Guard 2.
Okay.
And guess who was the aircraft commander selected to be the pilot?
I would, if this was Jeopardy, I would say, who is Don Trone?
Yeah.
How fun is that? Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
You got to be...
Yeah. So I've always been quite fond of that particular campaign.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great backstory, Don. Thank you for sharing that. And someday we'll talk more about what you know about Senior Bush.
Yeah, it was a great time. I will tell you that Barbara Bush is every bit of delight as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about the 10 things you can do to help quarantine your practice. I'll cover some of them. The first sounds kind of obvious, but it needs to be done, and that is we define leadership under behavioral governance in this new world. We define leadership as a person's capacity to inspire and engage others. And the two operative words are inspire and engage. And so one of the first things you need to quarantine your practice is to look back across your products, your services, your branding, your social media message, and look back and see if the total package is designed to inspire and engage others. And notice, when we talk about inspire and engage, competence, as we just talked about, is an element. But it's one of maybe 10 important elements. Inspire and engage requires that you demonstrate that you're collaborative, that you're aligned. We talked about of good character, that you're courageous, that you're adaptive, you're accountable. So there's 10 behaviors in particular that we know from neuroscience is going to impact the quality of a client relationship. And so get a hold of those 10 items and kind of hold it up against your practice and see if your practice is designed to inspire and engage others. you need to know, the second thing you need to do is, and this is part of your preparation for the new normal, revisit your sense of purpose, revisit your core values and your stated principles, and just do a destination check. Has anything changed? Has this COVID-19 pandemic changed your sense of purpose, changed your core values? Whether they've been changed or not, communicate with those, recommunicate to your clients your sense of purpose and your core values. Step number 3, the third thing to do is have a uniform decision-making process. And this is where I really depart from the regulators and the CFP board, because it is, and furthermore, this is wholly consistent with the mission of IW&I, and that's, promote the teaching of a prudent decision-making process and having discipline to apply that process. What you need to know with the fiduciary flu is you're going to have people calling themselves a fiduciary, yet because the new regulations do not define a process, they'll have no process to follow on with that claim that they're a fiduciary. I'll give you a good example. You think about the academic rigor that IWI has put into risk questionnaires, onboarding questionnaires, the quality of the investment policy statement, the quality of due diligence and selecting investment options, what should be contained in a performance report, when do you remove an investment option. All of those subjects that distinguish the elite financial advisor are not covered under proposed fiduciary standards. So one way to differentiate yourself from everyone else who's going to call themselves a process is to reinforce with your clients or prospects the fact that you have a well-defined process. The fourth thing to quarantine your practice, simplify your communications. What's coming in terms of new fiduciary rules and regulations, the complex disclosures, the content is so complex that it's going to have the opposite effect. And that is complexity actually makes it more difficult for a client to trust you. Now, by the way, Herman Brody and I don't totally agree on that. He believes the new fiduciary standards are going to establish a baseline, a floor on trust. I take a slightly different approach. I say complexity makes it much more difficult for a client to trust you. Number 5 is clean up your professional relationships. During a bull market, everybody's making money. No one's getting harmed. It's easy to turn a blind eye to a service provider or an advisor that is doing things they shouldn't be doing. In the new normal, it's unlikely that we're going to see a bull market anytime. I'm not a stock analyst. It's not going to be anytime soon. And we talked about the fact your client is going to be looking for the trusted advisor. In turn, who you associate with, the organizations you associate with, also going to be taken into consideration by your client. So you may want to, we would suggest you reassess all the professional relationships you have and decide maybe there are certain relationships you should begin to work your way out of because the ethos, the ethics of that organization, service provider, or advisor might not be what you want to be associated with.
Yeah. As you say that, Don, I'm sort of reminded of Jim Collins in his book Good to Great, where he talked about making sure that you have the right people on the right seats in the bus doing the right things. And maybe that's a good way for some people to think about reevaluating who their professional relationships are. Are they the right people in the right seats?
You are absolutely spot on. In fact, Bob, if you noticed in my signature line, I use the professional mark L5 after my name.
Mm-hmm.
And that came from Jim Collins. So when we were back in 2015, when the DOL rule came out, and I saw just how bad it was, and the effort to make everybody a fiduciary when they're simply not qualified.
Right.
I started to write an article about, when everyone's a fiduciary and yet they're not. And I was reminded of Jim Collins when he talked about Good to Great. And he opens the book by lamenting the fact that we're giving away the title leader and leadership away like candy. Today, everybody's a leader,
Right.
and yet they're not. And that's when he began to develop his concept of the 5 levels of leadership, with level 5, the level 5 leader being the exemplary leader, and describe what that is. So I wrote to Jim and explained the situation, what's going on in the financial services industry. And I said, I'd like to be able to find a way to describe the elite financial advisor as a level 5 advisor. Today, everyone's a fiduciary, and that they're not. So how do we identify the level 5 fiduciary and describe what that is? And so I said, Jim, I have this idea of using L5 as a professional mark to identify these level 5 advisors. Do you have a problem with that? And the problem with that being, does it encroach on your intellectual property and
Right.
branding?
Right.
And I was shocked. Within 48 hours, I got an email from him who said, first of all, thank you for asking. A lot of people would just normally just do something like that without asking.
Right.
And he said, I'm really pleased that his research influenced what we're doing in fiduciary.
Mm.
And he said, go right ahead. Yeah, use the L5 mark then for the level 5 fiduciary.
That's great. Small world.
Yeah.
Small world. So your step 6 in this is also interesting, right? You write that people should stop marketing yourself as a fiduciary. It's no longer going to be a point of differentiation. I mean, you touched on this a second ago, but it's interesting that in a world where people are told to be seeking a fiduciary, right? A lot of consumer-oriented websites are telling people to seek out someone who's a fiduciary. You're telling them perhaps just the opposite. The advisor, that is.
Yeah. What we're saying is use the words leader and steward. That clients get. The studies, the RAND study back, geez, when does that go back? 15 years, maybe 14, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, every study that has been done with consumers comes back and says, most of the consumers do not understand the concept of fiduciary or the word fiduciary. Mm-hmm. Now, when it's defined to them and you get leading questions in the surveys and so forth, they do come back and go, well, yeah, if that's what you're describing, yeah, I want one of those.
Right.
But they're going to struggle with fiduciary. They don't struggle with leader and steward. Leader and steward evokes a sense of passion, trust, as we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And so the better positioning is position yourself as a leader and a steward.
So I'm going to move on to some of the other articles that you've written. But before you do, there's a question that popped up in my head. You were describing the 3 characteristics of compassion and the third being competence, and I always struggle with that one, Don, because I always think it's hard for
Mhm.
an advisor to demonstrate competence and for a client prospect to identify what is competence, right? I mean, uh, passing the CFP exam or passing any exam does not necessarily indicate competence, other than I was competent at passing a test.
Academics would say that there's three ways that we evolve through education and training and the like. Um, Experience, I call them the three E's: experience, exposure, and education. And on a scale of 100, 70% of your development, let's stay with fiduciary. 70% of your development as a fiduciary is going to come from experience, and that's actually serving as a fiduciary. 20% is going to come from exposure, being exposed to elite fiduciaries, mentors who can teach you how to do it right. And then 10% comes from education. And so the designations, absolutely. You need the education. One of the first things, obviously, prospects and new clients are going to look at is to see that you have credentials and certain education pedigree. But after that initial introduction to the designations and the certifications, they're going to be looking for other skills, such as, and we've talked about this, one is simplicity. The sign of a true professional is somebody who can take a very complex process and simplify it so that the client can and pass around. That, by the way, is a mistake that we all have made over our careers, and I'm just as guilty as everybody else. And that is, we've always thought that to demonstrate our competence to our client, that we needed to show the client, give the client an idea of everything we know about a particular topic. Furthermore, taking that one step further, the more complex and industry terms and industry jargon we can throw at the client, then they'll trust us, quote unquote, even more. Yeah, you know, you know, or the classic IWI, with the SEMA. Well, here, let me show you how to calculate standard deviation by hand. What we now know from neuroscience is that just has the opposite effect. That I mentioned, that complexity increases the likelihood the client is not going to trust you. So one way to build that trust is to be able to simplify your process so the client can reach a comfort level with you. So
Right.
competence is not only having that technical knowledge, but it's being able to communicate that knowledge so that the average person can follow along. And if you wanted to take it one step further, the elite competent professional is that person who can take their work, their avocation, their profession, and inspire and engage others. And that's kind of, when you get to that point where you're able to inspire and engage prospects and clients with the critical work that you're doing, and you're at the apex, you're at the tip at the top.
Yeah. So, Don, compliments to you, because I think that might be the best explanation anyone's ever given when I've asked the question about demonstrating competence. So, kudos to you.
Well, the great example is think of the medical profession, the doctors that you like. Again, I'll share a personal story with you. My wife was diagnosed with cancer in 2014. And we knew from test results, and we knew from the expressions, the body English of the nurses that were dealing with my wife, that when we were going to be called into a meeting with the oncologist, we were not going to be given good news.
Right. So sorry to hear this.
And I remember that meeting. The doctor took a blank sheet of paper and with a pencil kind of drew where the cancer was and what they're going to be looking for and the steps in the process. And throughout the whole thing, it was plain English. Like I said, it was a pencil on a white piece of paper. He did never at any time tried to impress my wife and I with everything he knew. It was just simple, simple, simple.
Mm.
And I saw that throughout all her surgery and the like. This was, by the way, the Yale Hospital system. The emphasis everybody placed on simple, clear communication.
And I'm sorry to hear about this. Is the first I've learned about it, and I hope she's doing okay now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, all good
Yeah.
so far.
All
All
right.
good.
So you've penned several pieces for the special 401k specialist magazine. There's another, and and thankfully, what you've done is you've given advisors steps in each of these articles, or so it seems. And the one I'm looking at right now says 5 critical advisor steps to plan for your new normal. And once again, there's a great graphic that talks about these steps: about analyze, strategize, formalize, implement, and monitor. Do you mind going through some of these or all of them?
Sure. First of all, the 5 steps that's been with us. When I say with us, if you go back and look at the first book that I wrote, co-authored, Bill Albright, who's a INW&I member and SEMA designee. Our first book was Procedural Prudence, published back in 1989. And even back in 1989, we were talking about a 5-step process. What's also interesting, digress for a second, all the litigation that we're seeing today over fiduciary, everything, the basis for all these lawsuits today, we wrote about back in 1989. We specifically said, here's where you're going to get sued. And it's as relevant today as it was back in 1989. And we discovered about 5 years ago that particular book, Procedural Prudence, was selected by the staff of the Library of Congress for the law reading room at the Library of Congress.
Huh?
And the reason why it was selected for the reading room was it is the first book that talks about a uniform fiduciary standard. So this 5-step graphic you're talking about is today's version of that framework, and it is a universal framework. It can be used to help prepare any key decision maker who's going to serve in a critical leadership role. So we can use it today to help prepare for the new normal. So I'll kind of give you some illustrations. So the first step, analyze the current situation. As you prepare for the new normal, we want you to think about what has happened with your practice and your team during the lockdown. And it may be that during this lockdown, you have new emerging leaders on your team. Somebody that you had not maybe previously considered as an up-and-coming leader in the team begins to shine during work at home. And vice versa. Maybe you have somebody who you were thinking about for your succession, and they didn't rise to the top. In the second step, where you start talking about goals and objectives, I mentioned previously that as we start coming out of this new normal, or start coming out of the COVID-19, maybe your sense of purpose has changed. Maybe your core values, your stated principles. Maybe certain things are more important today than they were pre-COVID-19. So, for example, a key word that your clients are going to be looking for in the new normal is your capacity to be adaptive. Your mission statement. Do you need to rewrite your mission statement? Maybe certain goals that you had for your practice and your team are going to be changed. Another article I wrote was about the Jerry Maguire experience. I think, when Jerry talked about fewer clients, higher touch, I think we're going to see that coming out of, we're going to see that in a new normal. You're not going to, a lot of advisors are going to decide they cannot possibly manage as many client relationships as they have had in the past and give them the level of attention that they're going to need during the new normal. So you may be redefining your business strategy and your business purpose. The third step, identifying risks and assets. What kind of assets do you need for your new normal? Assets in terms of people, technology. Maybe you're going to need financial assets to give you more of a working capital for a cushion. Time horizons and expected outcomes are going to change. We used to talk about a long-term time horizon as 5 years or more. I think that's going to get shortened. We're going to start thinking about long-term time horizons in terms of maybe a year or 2 years, because so much is going to change in that time of frequency. Let me look through some of the other things that we have on this. By the way, it's 5 steps, but it's 55 questions. So the easiest thing.
Right, yeah. I wasn't going to ask you to detail on 55 questions from memory.
No, some of the other things, implementing the strategy. You mentioned Jim Collins. Do I have the right people on the bus? You're going to be reevaluating the skills of your staff. What skills have supported the organization to the pandemic? More importantly, what skills were you missing coming into the pandemic that you now realize you need to have? One great example is virtual meetings. Man, we've all had plenty, and we know that some of the meetings are terrific. You almost feel like you were there. In other meetings, you got 100 people on a webinar, and somebody puts their handset on hold, and the music starts playing. So that whole ability to come across with an authentic virtual relationship, that's going to be an important skill for a practice these days.
You also mentioned monitoring the step 5, or did I jump ahead?
No, I was just kind of seeing if you wanted to jump on another subject.
Oh, well, I guess let me put it this way. I'm looking at our clock, and we're heading up on 50 minutes of chatting, and I know we could go for another 48 minutes without any problem. Any things that you think we haven't touched upon that we ought to, or things that you've already spoken to but want to emphasize again?
No, but what I can tell you is what the next article probably will be, so you can kind of, so your listeners kind of get a sense of where we're headed. And it's called Looking at Fiduciary in 3D, 3 dimensions. And on that article, what we're looking at is we're saying the proposed fiduciary standards that are coming out are one-dimensional. They're based on a complex disclosure, and that's the sum total of what fiduciary is going to be defined as. It's one-dimensional. What we were doing for 35 years was a 2-dimensional model. We talked about a prudent process as the x-axis and best practices, fiduciary best practices as the y-axis. And the SEMA training, the training that's taking place at INWI, I would describe as 2-dimensional. We've got We're going to give you a process. We're going to define those best practices associated with that process. The next evolutionary step is the three-dimensional model. And the three-dimensional model is what we're calling behavioral governance. And so now your x-axis, your horizontal axis is governance, which is also process, and it's also fiduciary. You could, all those words could be used to describe the x-axis. The y-axis then are those leadership behaviors. Z-axis are the stewardship behaviors that are going to impact the quality of your decision-making process. So the new news, where we're going with training and the like is using neuroscience, which has identified the specific leadership and stewardship behaviors that are going to determine the quality of your decision-making process. So I could have two advisors both following the same process. Here's using the same technology. Here's my risk questionnaire. Here's my manager due diligence. Both exact same process. One's going to be more successful than the other, and what's going to determine that level of success is what is the advisor who's able to demonstrate those leadership and stewardship behaviors.
So I should ask you to let our listeners know where they can learn more about what you're doing and how to access some of the content that you're producing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Bob. A couple different ways. First of all, on LinkedIn, through the crisis, we're on LinkedIn every day. Pre-crisis, post-conference, will probably be 5 out of 7 days. So LinkedIn is, you can see the latest and greatest. We're posting articles with 401k specialists. The other is Iris. And Bob has already been beating me up. I need to start writing for him as well. I'll start doing that, Bob. I made that promise to you. Now, here's a case where the cobbler's kids have no shoes.
Okay.
The 3 Ethos website is terrible.
You've never been nothing if not honest, Don.
Yeah. I'm terrible. Well, I've got so much going on, And then the third way to stay in touch is just email me. And it's Don at 3 Ethos. I'll spell that, the number 3, numeric 3, Ethos, Echo, Tango, Hotel, Oscar, Sierra.com. That's the easiest way. Just express your interest, and then I'll keep your name and email and keep you up to speed on what we're working on.
Don, this has been a pleasure chatting with you today. I'm really hopeful that our listeners get a lot out of what we just talked about today, and also go read all the articles that you've written to get more details about what we just spoke about.
Yeah, well, thank you. The other comment, can I make one more comment as we close here? For the listeners, Bob and I go back, our relationship goes back, we think it's about 20 years.
At least.
And I remember the first time I met Bob, he came into our makeshift office. This is FI 360. And at the time, we were working on a handbook, the fiduciary handbook, which eventually was printed as Prudent Investment Practices. When that handbook came out, I can tell you that the industry, for the most part, didn't care until Enron broke in 2003, October 2003. When Enron broke, everyone realized that they did not know as much about fiduciary as they needed to know. And our work took off. The same thing's been going on with the research we've been doing with leadership and stewardship over the last 10 years. Again, it's not that nobody cared. I mean, everyone wants to be a better leader and a steward, but nobody was really putting any effort into it until COVID-19. And all of a sudden, this work that we've been doing for 10 years has become relevant. And in turn, we're able to take the research we've been working on and write these articles that you've been very kind in referencing throughout this presentation. And I think the new normal is going to be the same. People are going to struggle, both your clients and the advisors. And the research we've been doing is looks like it's going to be spot on.
Well, to my way of thinking, Don, you've always been ahead of your time with many of these concepts and practices, and so I'm gonna bet the ranch on this also becoming the thing as we go into the new normal.
You bet.
Well, thank you ever so much again, and we'll do this again if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for listening to this episode of our special series, Exceptional Advisors in Extraordinary Times. My guest was Don Trone, L5, the CEO and co-founder of 3 Ethos. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then don't miss our Exceptional Advisor webinar series, hosted by Tony Davidow, available at investmentsandwealth.org. Stay up to date and have the latest episode delivered straight to you by subscribing through iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The Institute stands ready to help you as you navigate these turbulent times with new resources, research, programs, accommodations for candidates, and certificates. For more details on resources available, visit www.investmentsandwealth.org. The Institute is a professional association, advanced education provider, and standards body for financial advisors, investment consultants, financial planners, and wealth managers who embrace excellence and ethics. Through our events, continuing education courses, and acclaimed certifications, which include the Certified Investment Management Analyst, Certified Private Wealth Advisor, and Retirement Management Advisor certifications, we deliver Ivy League and practical education for investment and wealth professionals. The Investments and Wealth Institute has been helping investment and wealth professionals become exceptional advisors for over 30 years. Please visit us at our website at investmentsandwealth.org to learn more about our certifications, conferences, online learning, and continuing education programs.